Hey everyone, welcome to Abilities. I'm going to be your moderator, Ms. Lindsay Judd. For our pro side, we have Danielle as our stater, Liz as our prover, and Ashley as our attacker. For the con side, we have Ashley as our stater, Lindsay as our prover, and Lauren as our attacker. The operational definitions for the different types of restraint safety hold. 2 staff members put him in a hold and restricts his ability to engage in physical aggression and self-injurious behavior. A non-example is a child asked to be picked up and spun around. An adult picks him up and spins him. During this time, the child's movement is restricted. A mechanical restraint is defined as any item or device added contingently in order to restrict the movement of an individual. This can include helmets, posy mitts, lap belts, or straitjackets. A chemical restraint is defined as any instance in which psychotropic medication administered as needed is used in order to control or rapidly decelerate risky behavior. Oftentimes, this is a sedative such as Ativan. This can be tablet or sublingual. For example, an individual is engaging in severe SIB and is screaming. Staff administer a PRN medication and this assists to calm him down, and then he sleeps for a few hours. A non-example is an individual has been diagnosed with ADHD and receives his daily dose of medicine for the day. Seclusion is defined as any instance in which an individual is intentionally isolated from other individuals, typically for safety or psychiatric reasons. It's not function-based. For example, a child is engaging in an extreme behavior and is throwing tables, chairs, etc. at other people. It is procedural exclusion or confinement timeout. When the timeout is complete, he/she is timed back into reinforcement.
Hi, my name's Danielle. I'm going to talk about appropriate use of restraints on the pro side. Restraints, such as physical management and mechanical restraints, are only used as a crisis or emergency procedure. They are inherently aversive. They are not meant to be used as punishment. They are only to be used when they are deemed clinically necessary, such as in cases of self-injury or severe aggression, not always for property destruction, only in instances where that property destruction looks like throwing chairs or some sort of heavy furniture that could injure another person. Additionally, immobilizing the arms of somebody who is using their arms for self-injury can reduce their self-injurious behavior. When functional communication training is used alongside with restraint, it can be effective for attention-maintained SIB. Restraint also extinguishes access to other reinforcement. For example, if an individual is acting dangerously and they are trying to get hold of some scissors or some sort of weapon, some sort of immobilization can help remove the access to those dangerous items. Lastly, and in conclusion, restraint can provide alternative forms of attention other than verbal attention, and is hopefully aversive. And very lastly, if a restraint is somehow reinforcing to the individual who is being held, that should not be part of that individual's treatment plan.
Hello, I'm Ashley, and I am the stater for the cons. The management of aggressive, self-injurious, and/or disruptive behavior of individuals with autism and other developmental disabilities can pose a significant challenge for the staff that's working with them. So it's become a commonly accepted practice to use restrictive measures such as restraint or seclusion to manage these behaviors. However, restraints and seclusions of all forms are often viewed as negative experiences that have no supporting evidence of effectiveness, and using these methods can be viewed as ethically unacceptable and infringement on the autonomy and dignity of the individual. Some ethical concerns that are debated about the use of restraints and seclusion include the potential for death or injury. According to the BACB Ethical Code 6.01, behavior analysts must uphold and advance the values, ethics, and principles of the profession, which include the core principle of doing no harm. The use of techniques that put individuals at a risk to be injured or die is considered unethical by many who believed they should be discontinued. Even if no physical injuries result from restraint or seclusion, there may also be psychological injuries to which the nature, extent, and duration is hard, if not impossible, to measure. The failure to use least intrusive interventions is also another issue. The Ethical Code 4.9 states that we must review and appraise the restrictiveness of procedures and always recommend the least restrictive ones to be likely effective. At times, however, the procedures and policies associated with them can be violated, misapplied, or abused, and may result from the failure to have actually used effective early interventions at the first sign of inappropriate behaviors, and can be implemented at times that they are not warranted. Typically, you're supposed to do it when they reach a crisis. However, they are often implemented before someone reaches a crisis in a situation. They also make inappropriate restrictions on the liberty and removal access to education for these children. Education is a basic right of children according to the Individuals with Disability Education Act, which establishes the right of children with disabilities to a free, appropriate public education. By removing them from the classroom for a significant amount of times, it can be a concern because a lot of these kids with special needs are already performing below grade level academically. So just removing them could add to this factor. Using potentially dangerous and ineffective interventions repeatedly is against the violation to effective treatment. That has to be validated as having both term and short-term benefits. The use of one that continues, and if the intervention is not working, then it should be changed. It has been disproportionately used with certain groups. Unfortunately, there is recent data that demonstrates the disproportionate use of restraints and seclusion with students who belong to certain minority groups or those who are disabled. And the last point is insufficient professional training, supervision, and monitoring. The BCAB Ethical Code states that behavior analysts will provide services, teach and conduct research only within the boundaries of their competence, and will only provide services, teach and conduct research in new areas after the appropriate training has taken place. It is widely acknowledged that more students with mental, emotional, and behavioral disorders than ever are being served in our public school system. So as a result, a lot of these kids are spending a lot of their day in general education settings. These teachers are not trained properly. They do not have the extensive advanced training, which could effectively mediate some of these behaviors, so it might be exacerbating them. So in conclusion, the use of restraints and seclusion is considered unethical. Seclusion is considered unethical by many to use with individuals with autism and other developmental disabilities.
Hi, I'm Liz, pro side. I'm going to be giving some proving evidence for the use of restraints and seclusion. So we previously heard the ethical concerns with restraint and seclusion, that there's a potential for injury or death with the use of these intrusive measures. We, however, on our pro side assert that the overall potential for injury or death would be low if restraint or seclusion is used least intrusively, when appropriate, and according to our federal and state policies and procedures. So for example, the ABAI provides their position on the use of restraint and seclusion and when it's necessary to use. And then all state affiliated organizations, they follow suit, as does the US Department of Education. Further, behavior management curriculums such as PCM or safety care, they're developed, as we know, from evidence-based practice. They're created by BCBAs, they use a least intrusive approach, and they're reinforcement-based, and that's key. So PCM and safety care's use of physical management, that's what they say and promote. So unfortunately, and in reality, injury or death can occur at any time when we're supporting individuals with challenging behavior. We know that. But staff who are properly trained and can appropriately use these restrictive analysts should ensure they implement reinforcement-based procedures, unless the severity or dangerousness of the behavior to restrict to procedures, they said it was unacceptable. But we on the pro side state that use of such procedures are sometimes necessary to produce safe and clinically significant behavior change. So the evidence here would be if an individual is placing themselves or others at risk, a client has the right to effective treatment. And that's as per the BACB Code 2.09. So these cases would require approval and only be used during crisis, the intrusive strategies that is, and only when clinically necessary. And that would be to keep all safe, right? So further evidence we provide for you today is by Van Houten et al. In their 1988 paper. And they summarize that the combination of punitive and positive base strategies, those used together, is currently the most effective treatment for those individuals who exhibit severe and dangerous behavior disorders. So that's pretty good evidence there, I'd say. Now, considering the warning we heard about restrictions on liberty and access to education or therapeutic environments, Compliance Code 2.09 A states that all clients have a right to effective treatment. It says that in their paper, 1988 again. And use of brief physical restraint, maybe response blocking, a procedural timeout, for example, can allow for an individual to remain socially included in that setting that they're in. And ongoing learning, we say, can occur with minor disruptions to others. So life will go on and learning will go on. Repeated use of dangerous and ineffective interventions, that claim, it shouldn't be encountered by any ethical BCBA who follows our compliance code. And federal regulations and the ABAI and any ethical BCBA just following that position on restraint and seclusion, we just know there has to be oversight and supervision. So there shouldn't be dangerous and use that's ineffective for too long. That shouldn't happen. We also do agree, unfortunately, there is disproportionate use of seclusion and restraint with certain critical groups. The current literature, when you look at it, indeed indicates that complex and challenging behavior is more likely in individuals with autism or intellectual and developmental disabilities. Friedman and Crabb say that in their 2018 paper. Thus, there's a higher prevalence of the use of restraint and seclusion with the population, yeah. However, Fisher and Lucelli, many other authors in the current literature also say that when restrictive procedures are used properly and effectively using an evidence-based approach, we've seen dramatic decreases in challenging behavior and an increase in socially significant behavior. So that's key. And then in conclusion, when we are all concerned, obviously, about the ethics involved with restraint and seclusion, good news is that there's federal policies, procedures to follow, our BCBA compliance code to guide us professionally, and there's always objective criteria for use, which is typically only in the case of imminent risk of harm.
So the failure to use policing and training for managing agitated patients. The training is focused on how to better handle individuals who are already individuals who were required a blood transfusion. The news article also reports that the extent of these injuries could have led to a fatality. This just goes to show us that injuries or even death is very possible and can happen quickly due to inappropriate restraints. It's also an example of how quickly restraints can go wrong and how easy it can be for some people to use too much force whenever initiating restraint. Inappropriate restrictions on liberty and to be trying to find the function of their behavior and come up with behavior plans surrounding that so we can keep them in their educational setting. There's many articles that report negative findings from students being placed in holds and seclusion. This includes injuries to staff as well as patients and potential death, but it could also further their aggression down the road, and it could also lead to PTSD. So in conclusion, we need to be finding alternatives to using restraints and seclusion and we shouldn't be using interventions that could potentially further the aggression of kids and lead to problems down the road.
There are professional guidelines for restraint and seclusion in place. The BACB ethical code states that behavior analysts must maintain knowledge of current scientific or professional information in their areas of practice and undertake ongoing efforts to maintain competence by obtaining and maintaining appropriate professional credentials. So for the people working with these individuals, they are required by our code to only work in the areas that they have knowledge. There are agencies that provide crisis resolution and de-escalation training for staff that includes techniques for the safe employment of physical interventions. Like she said, PCM, direct care staff, all of that. In addition, organizations have called for improving these safety monitorings during restraints by having all the appropriate educators trained in CPR, ensuring, some of them are ensuring the availability of portable automatic electronic defibrillators, and other relatively easy to use methods are available for monitoring signs of physiological danger during restraints as well. There are always, before someone is secluded or restrained, the professionals involved always consider the degree of unmanageability and the degree of danger. These are only used in crisis situations when people are being continuously aggressive, continually self-injurious, or are exhibiting high magnitude disruptive behavior. So some of the commonly cited reasons as to why these may be used is to prevent a child who is acting out of control from harming themselves or others, including the staffs and other patients. When individuals have violent outbursts, you can't really control where they are when it takes place. There may be other people in the vicinity, and it can be dangerous for anyone who's around, even if they weren't directly involved. So sometimes the easiest way, especially depending on the number of individuals in the area, maybe to just clear the area or to remove the person through a physical transportation procedure. Also, to prevent an individual from engaging in property damage. It not only contains the destructive behavior, but there's always a risk of them harming themselves in the process of them destroying property. So it may be necessary to employ transportation procedures to a designated safe room to ensure that the individual does not harm themselves in the process of their outbursts. It can bring sense of control to a unit or a classroom, which will help group contagion from happening, and also avoids rewarding and thus reinforcing this violent and destructive behavior. Because if you leave a child in the classroom behaving like that, you can't control what the other kids are doing. So the other kids laughing, smiling may reinforce that behavior as well. It's also used to respond to a rule violation or other acts of compliance when other least restrictive methods have been proven ineffective. BACB Ethical Code 4.09, it does say least restrictive methods must be used, but this does leave it up to the behavior analyst to determine what methods to be used. And if the child is engaging in a high magnitude behavior, then we have to use higher levels. As the level of restriction increases, if the resistance increases, but we also decrease as the resistance decreases. It can be used to promote self-control and enhance coping skills. It can be an interactive process in which the care worker listens and responds to the child, because restraints encourage the child to verbalize their strong feelings rather than act them out, which can help promote coping skills and internal means of self-control through the verbalization of difficult feelings to attain that enhanced affect regulation. It can be used as a therapeutic intervention to modify inappropriate behaviors such as FICA of people with a mental handicap or self-injurious behavior. It can be used for custodial purposes to capture someone who's attempting or has escaped from a facility that they're staying at. It can also be used to decrease sensory input. For example, when a person is overwhelmed with stimuli and can't process anymore, because according to the BACB Ethical Code 4.07, it states that environmental conditions that prevent the implementation of a behavior change program, analysts must seek to eliminate these obstacles that are responsible. So yes, some people may consider it unethical, but in conclusion, sometimes it is necessary depending on the behavior that the individual is engaging in.
I'm Lauren, and I'm here to counter the arguments that we've heard for the use of restraint and seclusion. Arguments that was stated was that restraint and seclusion is used only as a crisis or emergency intervention. However, according to research by Peterson, Ryan, and Billingsley, 2016, there's actually insufficient professional training and monitoring regarding restraint and seclusion. Therefore, the individual is trained to know when another individual is actually in a crisis situation. And this also relates to the BACB code 1.03, which talks about maintaining competence through professional development. We need to put an emphasis on more training and research on interventions related to restraint and seclusion, because currently there's no studies to show safety monitoring of restraint techniques. Another argument we heard was that immobilization is an effective intervention for reducing challenging behaviors such as SIBs. However, are less restrictive interventions being used before immobilization? And this relates to BACB code 4.09, which talks about making sure we use least restrictive procedures. These interventions, such as immobilization, can be used just as a quick ending to the behavior, and they may be used without trying antecedent, de-escalation, or prevention strategies first. And is restraint and seclusion appropriate when there's a risk of death? These methods of restraint and seclusion are potentially dangerous and ineffective methods. We have an obligation to do no harm as behavior analysts, and that might not be in place if someone doesn't have the right training and monitoring when implementing the techniques. In regards to effectiveness, if restraint and seclusion are being repeatedly used, that is showing that they are ineffective for the individual. In a literature review that was used for the use of restraint and seclusion, by Fisher, 1994, it discussed arguments for the use, and they concluded their review by stating that seclusion and restraint are basically effective in preventing injury and producing agitation. So basically, the word basically, when I heard that, is 10 children in the US actually die each year due to restraint, and numerous others do suffer injuries. Another main point is that we can teach replacement behaviors such as functional communication training in conjunction with the use of restraints. And I think that we can all agree that replacement behaviors such as FCT needs to be implemented. However, restraining or secluding the child is actually taking away their right to education. If they are unable to be educated, how are they going to be taught the academics and skills that they have deficits in, and maybe causing these challenging behaviors? And this relates to BACB code 2.05A, which talks about the rights of our clients. Our clients have the right to be in an educational setting and being provided with the education to decrease these deficits. Another argument was that restraint actually extinguishes access to other reinforcement and is aversive. However, this is not true if the restraint is serving as reinforcement by giving that individual attention or allowing them to escape from a difficult task. And with an emphasis on insufficient training being given, it questions whether there was an FA or FBA done before implementing these interventions to understand the functions. In conclusion, I found that these arguments show that there are many cons to using restraint and seclusion. Most are stemming from insufficient training and monitoring. There needs to be more universal training and policies and research on the use of restraint and seclusion before implementation.
So to sum up the pro side's arguments, yes, these procedures are inherently risky. Yes, there is a potential to reinforce attention-seeking behaviors or escape-maintain behaviors, and there is a lack of training. But there are, within these training procedure modules, such as QBS and PCM, they are built off of a least to most restrictive intervention model. So staff who are trained in these procedures should be using de-escalation tactics and antecedent strategies prior to crisis intervention. And once again, to put emphasis on the fact that it is an emergency intervention procedure in order to prevent injury to the individual and those around them.
To sum up the con sides, the use of restraints and seclusions of all forms on individuals who have some sort of developmental disability or autism are often viewed as negative experiences that have no supporting evidence of effectiveness, and using these methods is often viewed as ethically unacceptable and an infringement on the dignity of the individual and on their autonomy. Prevention is key, and it can be achieved with just little antecedent manipulations in the environment. So in conclusion, if the individual does escalate to the point of a crisis, least restrictive methods should always be used first, but before restraint and seclusion, alternative methods should be sought.
Okay, so for some field questions, the first one is, training can be a potential issue for those who perform restraints. Are there any strategies or methods that can help improve training for administering restraints and or decrease the need for restraints?
According to Sherman, Peterson, Billingson, and Ryan, 2016, insufficient training in crisis management may be rooted to the lack of effective intervention training. So staff may have training on a crisis intervention strategy such as CPI, but that does not mean that they have the ability to de-escalate a situation or apply antecedent interventions. They continue to state that there needs to be more training than just simply crisis management and to improve training, there should be a comprehensive training that includes obtaining experience with challenging behaviors, having the ability to engage in quick decision-making, and training on a variety of prevention strategies.
And to add to that, when we look at Compliance Code 4.08D, it states that behavior analysts must ensure that any aversive procedures are accompanied by an increased level of based curriculums are preferred when training staff and mediators as a lecture component, and then the trainer models the skill using BST principles, and the trainees have to meet mastery criteria, usually 100%, in demonstration of those skills. So they have to show competency, and that's key. Errorless learning is used, there's verbal feedback provided, and there's opportunities for completion of role plays to practice the skills again and again. So overall, Reed and Green in their 2012 literature, this is the most effective method for skill acquisition, generalization, and maintenance of trainee skills as it's evidence-based practice. So that is key with training.
Okay. For question 2 is, the use of restraints or seclusion vary from setting to setting. For example, in Indiana, McCann one setting, but then moves to a new setting where that type of restraint is not allowed.
So we believe that there should be a universal training methodology for these types of procedures that are across the board and across state to state, so that there is more regularity between these procedures. However, under our current guidelines and differentiation between procedures on a state-to-state basis, we believe that it is the responsibility of the facility to be informed about those treatment settings that their individual is going into. So if they have a client who is currently being managed under mechanical restraints and they know they're going to be going to an adult program or some other type of program wherein they're not going to be able to utilize those restraints, they either need to fade to a different restraint methodology, or they need to find for them a better, more appropriate placement that could use mechanical restraints if they are still deemed necessary for that individual. And that might even include up to psychiatric facilities rather than a more general population adult facility or a least restrictive environment.
Question 3 is, do you have any personal experience related to this topic that you would like to share?
So I worked at alternative facility school for 4 years where we dealt with aggression on a daily basis and did physical management on a daily basis. And I also taught safety care for 2 years.
I have worked at a few EBA centers, and my training definitely varied setting by setting. I was trained in one setting in PCMI where we were required to do a 22-hour training with skill and written tests. And then on the other hand, I got certified in crisis management in a 3-hour workshop, and that training was supposed to be good for 2 years. And just my experience itself helps prove the inconsistencies in restraint and seclusion, and how there needs to be a more universal training to help remove these stigmas related to restraint and seclusion.
So I'm in Ontario, Canada, and a lot of our policies and procedures on restraint and seclusion are quite similar because we follow the ABAI affiliate organization's, position. Either way, I'm an outreach behavior consultant in my current role. I work with adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. They have severe, challenging behaviors. They're typically coming out of treatment facilities or forensic settings. So I get to encounter this type of ethical situation on a daily basis where we have to, consider the risks and benefits of certain interventions, look at historic interventions, complete assessments, develop the interventions that may actually include a form of restraint and or seclusion if function-based and appropriate, and used least intrusively. So yeah, I think we can all agree we have a lot of experience in the field. And yeah, I'm also a safety care trainer, have been for 6 years. So this is an interesting topic for all of us.